welcome to today's podcast episode. My name is Nikita Phillips, and I am a candidate support and business development advisor here at Bespoke Training Solutions. Today, I am joined by Luke Mapley, who is a qualified financial advisor based at Gower Financial Services in Guernsey. And today, we're going to be talking all things AF7, which is the Pension Transfers exam awarded by the CII. Now, the reason I've asked Luke to come on to today's podcast is because we both recently sat AF7 in March 2024. And we made the promise that if we both passed that exam, we would create some content to hopefully support others who may be considering sitting this unit. So welcome, Luke. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast today. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. And for those that haven't heard of Luke before, we have done some other content with him. So if you're thinking about sitting AF8, we have also created content with Luke before, so do check that out. But for those that don't know a lot about AF7, I thought a good place to start would be to give a quick introduction to the AF7 exam. So AF7 is a level 6 exam, and as I've said before, it's awarded by the Chartered Insurance Institute. It forms part of the level 6 award in regulated pension transfer advice. So if you want to become a pension transfer specialist, then this is the qualification for you. It is a 2-hour typed exam, and it's a little bit different to the other AF units in that there is a section A at the beginning, which consists of 3 to 4 written short answer questions. And then section B asks you questions based on 2 different case studies. You need a 60% pass mark to be successful in this exam. And in 2023, the pass rate for this unit was basically 50%. So half of candidates are deferring their success. It is worth 20 credits, and we're going to discuss that in a bit more detail shortly, because often the fact that it's only worth 20 credits is one of the reasons why people don't sit this exam. But I think myself and Luke would argue that this is a great exam to have under your belt. So, Luke, I think a great place to start is to ask why you sat AF7 and what your motivations were behind sitting this exam.
Yeah, absolutely. So what led me to AF7 was I'd already achieved 90 of the 120 credits I needed for my advanced diploma. So I knew that I needed to finish at least one more advanced diploma unit to complete the qualification. I wanted to complete AF7 because I felt that the knowledge I would gain on defined benefit pensions and sort of the advice around transferring them would be more useful for my job than what I'd gained from AF4, which is investment planning, or AF1, which is tax and trusts. And those are sort of the 3 units I had left to choose from. I was initially put off taking AF7 because, just like you mentioned, it only provides 20 advanced diploma credits rather than the usual 30. But I then found out that I could potentially top up the missing 10 credits by applying for recognition of prior learning. So once I found that out, I decided to go down that route and take AF7 and then get recognition of prior learning for the remaining credits rather than taking AF4 or AF1, as that would meant that I get enough credits to complete the advanced diploma and give me the defined benefit pension knowledge I was looking for my studies.
Perfect. Okay, great. And I think that's something that often goes amiss, actually. I think candidates aren't really aware that you can get qualifications elsewhere that may qualify for recognition of prior learning. So if, for example, you've done a degree, it's worth checking that out with the CII, because actually you could get credits towards that level 6 diploma. And what I would say is, again, when I was planning out my chartered journey, I disregarded AF7 straight away because I thought, right, it's 20 credits. That means I'm going to have to do 5 level 6 exams rather than 4. But actually, what I would recommend to anyone is sit and think, why are you doing these exams? And it's actually to extend your knowledge. So think about which exam is going to add greater value rather than just the credit value of the exam. That would be my advice. And I suppose, like, did you have sort of any initial thoughts about AF7 before studying the unit? What were your initial thoughts about the exam?
I think when I started studying it, because I didn't know much about it beforehand, other than it was just about pension transfers. So that's kind of as much as I knew. But when I started, I think I found that although it was quite a narrow syllabus in the sense of it almost focuses entirely on the advice and suitability of transferring it from a defined benefit pension to a defined contribution scheme. So it's quite a narrow syllabus compared with some of the other units. But even despite that, there's a lot you have to learn around that. There's things like regulations, such as COBS 19 from the FCA handbook. You have to know a lot about defined benefit schemes and defined contribution schemes, death benefits, tax treatment. There's a lot in there. So I guess my initial thoughts were it was a unit that I struggled to get my head around when I got going with it, but it was also a unit that, looking back and reflecting, it's one I found far more beneficial than some of the other CIO units I've taken over the years, in terms of the knowledge I've gained for my day-to-day role, which is very useful going forward.
Yeah, no, that's great. And again, I think when people look at the syllabus, they think, oh, it's very short, it's very it only covers certain elements, but there definitely is a lot to learn for AF7. So don't go into the exam and underestimate it. There's so much to know. And I think as well, with it only being 20 credits, people think it's going to be an easier exam. But I wouldn't say that is going to be the case. I actually think in my mind, it should be worth more than 20 credits because there is so much you've got to digest and take in. So I'd say that's a pretty common initial thought that people have about AF7 is they look at that syllabus and think, right, okay, this is going to be a walk in the park, but it isn't. And sort of leading on from that, what would you say was the most challenging part of AF7 for you?
In terms of challenges, I would say, I mean, in AF7, there's some questions that will nearly always come up, such as sort of fact-finding questions, why you would or wouldn't transfer it from a DB scheme into a DC scheme. And there's ones that they're the questions that you can prepare for, and have a really good idea when you go into the exam that I will get a question around this in some way, and I can probably pick up some easy marks as long as I do the right preparation. But I think the most challenging part of AF7 is, and we found this on our sitting, is that there will be some curveball questions that you just realistically couldn't have prepared for, and you either know it or you don't. So we have one, it was about spousal bypass trusts.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just remember looking at it on the day, and under the exam pressure and conditions, I just sat there and I just didn't answer. And I would have scored one at best, probably nothing on that question. So I think that was probably the biggest challenge, is there are just some really nitty-gritty, obscure parts of pension transfer advice that you could read the whole of COBS 19, you could read every study guide out there, but it's just not physically possible to retain all that knowledge. Yeah. So I think there are ways you can sort of prepare around that, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a moment. But I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges, is just if you get something that comes up that you just don't know the answer to, that you realistically couldn't have prepared for, it can throw you a little bit on the day.
Yeah, it's definitely different when you compare it to the multiple choice questions, 100%, because when you get those exams, you can make an educated guess. But like you say, if you get something that comes up in the day and you have no idea, there are no real educated guesses. And I actually think one of my biggest challenges with AF7 was around the interpretation of the questions, because I know we spoke after the exam and there was a question about APTA on the exam, which comes up quite frequently actually, but the way it was worded really threw us, I think, both of us off. And actually when I read the examiner's report, they basically said in that everyone really struggled with it because they weren't sure what was being asked. So I think making sure that you're accurately interpreting the questions as well, it is quite a big challenge with AF7, and it can make a big difference between a pass or a fail, unfortunately. So that's something I'd recommend people be mindful of as well. And I suppose leading on from that, was there anything about AF7 that took you by surprise?
I think for me, the surprise bit was how quickly the time goes. So you mentioned earlier it's a 2-hour exam, and when you start sort of the first couple of questions, that's ages. So I've got a long time to go, and you're plodding through the exam. I remember I was writing my last answer. I think I had about 5 minutes left to go. So
Right.
whereas like the RO multiple choice exams, I quite often find I used to have 20, 30 minutes left just to go back through my answers, nice and leisurely. I did not have that there 7. So that was the thing that took me by surprise. And what I take out of that, again, looking back, is if there is a curveball question that comes up that you just don't know the answer to, rather than just sitting there thinking about it, you're probably best just to move on. And then if you've got focus on the ones you can answer and then come back to the trickier ones at the end.
Yeah, no, that's something that we'd always recommend as well to candidates at BTS, because when you open up an exam, there are different ways to approach it. And one of those ways is people will open it up and they'll work through it numerically, and that's fine. But what you might find is you'll come across a question, a curveball question, and it will sink your confidence and you will start to really panic. So, what I tend to say to people is actually open up the exam and read all of the questions first. For example, with AF7, you might want to start on section A. Because obviously there's those short answer questions, which I quite enjoyed. I don't know about you, Luke, but I thought they were quite nice and they boosted my confidence ready to go into section B. But what I would say is read through the paper first and start with those questions that you're most confident with and where you're going to score the maximum marks. And then actually come back to those ones that you've struggled with at the end, because the system does have the facility to flag questions. So that 2 hours, as you say, does go by really, really quickly. And I think when I think about AF7 and what took me by surprise, I think about the actual content that was covered, because when I was sat looking at it a couple of years ago, I thought, well, pension transfers, I don't do a lot about that. So how is it going to be relevant to what I do? Then actually, when I got into it, we learned so much more about different elements, about, for example, DC pensions and the death benefits around them and the taxation and the various access options. So for me, the biggest surprise was this is not just a DB exam. Yes, it's going to cover defined benefit transfers in some extent, but it's also going to cover so much about the DC side as well and the taxation and the death options available to them. So but yeah, definitely some things to be mindful of. And then when it comes to your study, how did you approach your study? And if you could go back and change your approach, would you change anything or would you stick with what you did?
So I think I would mostly stick with what I did. The way I approached things were, we talked earlier on about how there's some curveball questions that come up that you just realistically couldn't have prepared for. So, and I kind of knew that was going to be the case from some of the mocks I did beforehand, because there were some questions that come up which I thought I could study the pension transfer club all day long, but the chances are it's not going to come up. So what I tried to do was focus on the questions that I knew would be coming up, or in some way, because they had done in every previous mock. So for example, I knew that realistically we were going to get at least one fact-finding question, and we ended up getting 2 of them.
Yeah.
I knew that we were also going to get one question around you've been presented with a defined benefit scheme, a set of objectives, and you'd have to just sort of explain why you would or wouldn't recommend transferring into a defined contribution arrangement. There was going to be something around that. And within those question types, there's quite often some really easy marks to pick up that are fairly universal across all the different AF7 exams that have come up in the past. So, for example, with a fact-finding question, you usually have to tell the examiner the additional information you would need from either the member or the defined benefit scheme admin, the additional information you need before you can make a recommendation. And there's some straightforward marks that you would pick up, such as what's the member's attitude to risk, what's their tax position, what income do they need in retirement, what age are they looking to retire, and just really nothing rocket science, just areas that you would be speaking to your clients about in real life conversations anyway. And I mean, and for like a 10-mark fact find question, I've just listed 3 or 4 marks there, which I've just literally listed them off the bat. And that's not far off half the marks the 60% you would need And I'm sure if I actually put some time and revision into it, like you would before the exam, there's a lot more easy marks you can pick up.
Yeah.
So that's how I focus most of my studying, is look at the staple questions which we will be getting, really understand those sort of lists that you can just regurgitate onto the exam on the day. And it would mean that if we do get a question on spousal bypass trusts or something else that I'm going to potentially fall down on, I would hopefully have picked up enough sort of 90 to 100% marks on the certain questions to prop up the overall score.
Yeah, perfect. And to be honest, I would say that's the approach I took as well, because I mean, a little while ago when we spoke about doing AF7, because we actually agreed to motivate each other, didn't we? But I remember
Yeah,
you saying to me that one of your colleagues had done the exam, and what she'd done was master basically section A with those short answer questions, so that she could
yeah,
go into section B feeling really confident. So I took that approach too, in that I worked through loads and loads of past papers. I made little flashcards with the different elements that would come up. And I think that actually section A probably carried me through that exam, whereas
yeah,
section B, I was able to drop a couple of marks. And I would say as well, when it comes to your studying, there's going to be certain areas in any exam that you're not going to get. I think for me, it was the lifetime allowance this time, which caused me a couple of issues. And so I kind of decided that I would focus heavily on the other areas because I just couldn't get it in my head. So I would say prioritize the areas that you are going to get. And if there's any areas in that exam that you think I can't get my head around it, just accept that a question may come up. But if you do good enough in the other areas, then you may well do okay. But yeah, I definitely agree. Definitely use your past papers as well. So you can access them on the CIO website or through the BTS Career Zone, but work your way through as many past papers as possible to get familiar with how to answer those questions. But thanks, Luke, there's some really great tips there. And I would say as well, having sat the exam now, would you say to others, go for AF7? Would you recommend this exam?
yes, I definitely would. I think for me, again, looking back and reflecting, it's a really passable unit if you put the work in. It's not easy by any stretch of the imagination because it's an advanced exam, but there's so many easy marks you can pick up just from, like just mentioned, Nikita, doing past papers, just practice, practice, practice. And there's some really easy marks to pick up. I would say if you're in sort of financial planning or para planning in sort of your real life role, then DB pensions, even if you're not transferring them, they're a really vital part of real life financial planning conversations. And it's great now. I mean, I had a bit of knowledge about defined benefit pensions before I took AF7, but now when a client comes in with their defined benefit pension statement, I can sit there reading it and I understand everything on there. Whereas before, I maybe wouldn't have been able to pick up every point that's on there. So I'd say it's really relevant to your real life client conversations. And also going back to the point we made right at the beginning about it being only 20 credits, I would say don't let that put you off. There are other ways you can pick up. If you're maybe 10 points short of the advanced diploma, you can get recognition of prior learning. So you may have a degree that you didn't think would count. I personally, I completed a course, a financial planning, a practical investment planning course, which gave me 15 advanced credits, which I then put towards the diploma, advanced diploma, and that let me complete the qualification along with AF7. So I would say in summary, yes, there's lots of reasons to take AF7, and it's also one of the units I think has given me the most value to my day-to-day role compared with others.
Perfect. To be honest, Luke, I have to agree with everything that you've just said there. I remember being a power planner and requesting a letter of authority from a DB scheme
Mm-hmm.
and getting that information back and not knowing what any of it meant. So God knows how clients feel in that situation, because I actually had some knowledge around pensions, but actually I was completely clueless. I didn't know about funding status and why that mattered, or what the protection was for these types of schemes, how we worked out whether they had enhanced tax-free cash and lots of other elements. So actually now I think that if I requested those bits of information again, I would be able to interpret it a lot more accurately. So for anyone that is in two minds about this exam, for me, I think I am going to go ahead and sit 5 AF exams. And yes, AF7 has meant that I've had to take another exam, but actually the knowledge it has given me, as well as the extra accreditation of the award and pension transfer advice, I would 100% wholeheartedly go for this exam again. If you think that your pensions knowledge needs a little bit of work, then this is absolutely the best exam that you can do. And at BTS, we do have support for AF7. So myself, and I think, Luke, did you use our study guide as well?
Yep, I did. Yeah, really
Yeah, perfect. So we have an AF7 study guide, which breaks everything down into nice, easily digestible chunks. And we also have an e-learning module for AF7 as well. So do check out the BTS support for the exam. And absolutely, if you're in two minds, just absolutely go for it. But I'd say, Luke, we've kept that nice and short and sweet, which I think is always great. And I really, really do want to say thank you for coming on here today. Hopefully, we've helped people who are in a little bit two minds about whether to take the exam. But I'm looking forward to hopefully working with you again on some future podcasts.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thanks everyone for listening. If you've got any questions about AF7, do reach out. You can email us at inquiries@bespoketrainingsolutions.com.